What's going on? Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Let me take a look at something right quick. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Lewis, good morning. Good morning. It's Tuesday. We do have midterm elections going on. That's pretty much the focus this morning. That's like the spotlight. I think that's what everyone's discussing around pretty much TV, CNBC, Bloomberg. That's pretty much the highlight right now, amongst pretty much also our upcoming CPI data. That's still pretty much around the corner here, incoming on Thursday. So right now, I mean, looking at structurally, if you can see my stream here right now, we're basically just looking at a nice little rising wedge action taking place, and we are basically getting close enough towards the tip of this rising wedge, as futures just decided to pump here in the last 5 minutes or so before I started up my live. So I am watching resistance here on futures. 38.37 is what I'm looking at on this push that we are experiencing right now. So 38.37 is going to be that level of resistance that I watch. If we blow through 38.37, and that's the major concern for what should be a bearish rising wedge, is going to end up turning bullish if we break this overhead resistance that we have over 38.37, and then that would set us up towards our next level resistance at 38.57, in which case it would potentially invalidate the bearish rising wedge, and we would continue to push to the upside here as we lean into CPI on a positive note. And if I'm not mistaken, just off of memory here, it already has been about 2 days that the market's been relatively green here, that we've been continuing to push. So that's something to keep in mind as the streak per se continues here. If we go into tomorrow continuing to be green, exactly at what given point, and if CPI data is going to be that X factor to snap that streak. So that's something that's also on my mind here. Just kind of things that kind of caught my attention as well. We did have to take Two Interactive. They had earnings this morning. They're down roughly about double digits. We also got a news alert about Tesla regarding about 40,000 in recalls for their cars. So that was something that was a little bit puzzling at when the news first broke, because the stock didn't actually react to it at all. And then we started to see the stock basically drop about $2 here pre-market. So that was an interesting factor as well. One thing I actually did want to highlight this morning, and this was something that more so caught my attention towards about after the opening bell here, or more so about 30 minutes into the opening bell, is more so the rotation that's happening within the sector here right now. And when I say sector, I mean more so between the tech sector. And what we saw yesterday was we saw Tesla just basically nosedive. I'll get to the chart here in a second. But as we saw Tesla continuing to nosedive, we saw it set a new 52-week low yesterday. What was pretty much the counteract for the market continuing to stay elevated as it did, and basically giving us a little bit of a trend day yesterday? Well, we saw Microsoft, we saw the technicals on that. It basically continued to pretty much grind higher. That was a beautiful breakout off of that one yesterday. I highlighted the news that was pretty much regarding Meta. We saw they actually were basically laying off their workers, and that would actually help balance their books out even further. And the stock basically rallied off of that as well. And then the other insight was that we basically saw maybe a number of names here actually recover more so. We saw Apple recover off of its morning news. We saw the semis actually give us a nice little recovery as well. So you had names that basically offset that downfall from Tesla. Well, the question mark today is if Tesla is going to be that downfall, or vice versa, maybe it's Microsoft or Apple. What's going to be the counteract to, if we continue to rally here as we're pushing this morning? What's going to be that counteract to give us that lift for us to have another push to the upside? All right, so that's one of the things that I'm going to pay attention to this morning. If we see Tesla be that weakness again, like it was yesterday, then I want to see exactly what other name particularly is going to be able to lift the market higher. With the semis actually being relatively green this morning, I believe there's also some relative news on Nvidia as well in regards to China on a positive sentiment. Let's see how much more room Nvidia particularly has with the semis rallying behind it if we do see further upside. And then, of course, the two bigger names that I just mentioned was Apple and Microsoft. Is there going to be a rotation into one of those two names here? Is Microsoft going to lead it yet again, or is Apple going to take the reins here and actually be the one that lifts the market higher despite whatever Tesla may do? All right. So that's something that I wanted to just pretty much bring to your attention. Something that you want to basically look at once we get to the opening bell here. Look to see how that rotation is taking place within the tech sector, especially if the fact that we know that Tesla has that a weekly head and shoulders, which I'll pretty much pull up the chart here in a second. Being that the fact that it has the head and shoulders, we see the weakness, we see the news alert to basically back a further weakness today. What's going to be able to lift the market higher in the other part of that sector? All right. So getting just right quick, right back to futures. I did mention I was watching resistance here, 38.37. If we blow past 38.37, then that would potentially set us up to break resistance of the rising wedge to the upside, therefore invalidating the rising wedge, which is typically a bearish pattern. And then our next level of resistance here would be setting up towards 38.57 today, which will be a pretty nice little push to the upside. We'll likely get a little bit of a move towards 38.47, a nice little retest, and then we'll get that push up towards 38.57. All right, so that's what I'm looking at for the upside. Otherwise, vice versa to the downside here. I'm looking for a break below 38.16 and then confirm a breakdown if it were to occur below 38.05, setting us up for our first PT at 37.82 if we start to see acceleration to the downside. All right, so that's just levels north and south. That's basically what I will say as of right now, looking at futures. But that wedge is basically closing in. Let's see how tighter it can stay within the parameters of that resistance and support before we get a directional break. All right, and that's going to be the more concerning part as well. If those of you trying to maybe you have that habit of getting into entries early, be cautious about that. I would likely say wait to see if we get a break. We get a convincing break and we push north over 38.37. You may be able to particularly get into calls at that given point, and that'll be a better opportunity of saying, okay, futures look to have broken over resistance, and then you can get into the play for the further upside, in particularly a trend day. Otherwise, look to see if we break below that 38.16 mark and if the market wants to give back these gains that we've had in the past 2 days here. All right. So that's looking at futures. I was going to mention about looking at Tesla here. Dropping this out towards the weekly gives you the better picture overall. But what's been on everyone's pretty much probably all around Twitter, all around stock tweets as well. But you basically see a nice little head and shoulders action on Tesla. I believe it was also illustrated on CNBC yesterday. So a lot of eyes are on this weekly head and shoulders as well. But it is happening to play out. The only factor is that the continuation is more so happening about overnight here pre-market, to say the better term, and that's the downfall. If you didn't swing puts, then you're likely gonna miss the pretty much this little roughly 1.5% drop this morning. But looking at the head and shoulders, I'm watching resistance here up towards 197 is where I have resistance. If we get any kind of bounce, look to see if we retest basically at that open where we should have been. At 197, above 197, then my next resistance is at 201 half. And we can see this ultimately push towards 203 if we see any kind of retracement and we see a nice little recovery off of this morning price action. All right. So those are levels to the upside. Otherwise, downside levels that I'm looking for here on Tesla. I want to see this get a nice flush below 193. I'm targeting 187, and then 179 half is where I basically have my next level of support. All right. So those are the two key levels to the downside. 187, 197, 179 are those two levels I'm watching to the downside. Otherwise, watch to see if we reclaim the 197. Then you target 201 and 203 to the upside. All right. But I'm a little bit more skeptical about the fact that since everyone has their eyes on this head and shoulders for the weekly, that it's not going to necessarily play out as we anticipate for it to get continuation to the downside today. I'm a little bit more hesitant, so that's why I am going to wait to see if we get the breakdown where I want it, below that 193. Otherwise, that may end up just being a little bit of an overshoot at the opening bell to the downside, and then we're going to likely see a sporadic recovery and then push this right back towards that 201 spot. That's what I'm a little bit more hesitant, especially if the market does rally. That's what you want to say, okay, this is where I need to respect my levels, especially at this given point when you know all eyes are on one given ticker as it is right now with Tesla on that weekly head and shoulders. All right. So that's something you definitely want to keep an eye on and don't try to jump the gun on is the better term that I want to say for you guys. By the way, Keith, I don't know if I said good morning to you, but good morning. Veer, what's going on? Good morning. Let's kind of go down the line here. Let's see what else we can actually take a look at. Let's see what are the names. I will say Netflix actually was one that kind of piqued my interest. Now, looking at Netflix here on the weekly, you do have a bearish setup here. You do have an ascending broadening wedge, which is typically a bearish pattern. It's actually the inverse of my favorite pattern, a descending broadening wedge, right? Which would basically just be a flip of that entire structure, right? But what I'm actually looking for is if we do see the market continuing to push off of this morning pump, I actually do have two levels of resistance that I'm watching. One being an actual marquee level, which I potentially see this actually testing as a resistance. But the key level to basically push up towards our first PT here will be 266. And then the 271 half spot is more so the bigger level that I'm watching. And if I actually zoom out the chart here, particularly, that 271 level has actually acted as a relatively resistance on multiple occasions, actually dating back towards 2018 is where that level actually dates back to for that 271 half spot. So I'm more inclined to say that if we do see Netflix pretty much rally, and this is where, if you guys heard my little diatribe about saying that we saw how Tesla dropped yesterday, but we saw other names pick up momentum. Look to see if Tesla continues the downfall or maybe Apple takes the downfall today. Look to see if Netflix is actually one of those names that actually pick up the momentum and hold the market up within a rotation of the sector. Okay. So again, PTs though, I'm watching 266 and that 271 half level is ideally where I'm actually looking at if we do see a strong push today on Netflix. This is going to be pretty high on my radar here towards that 271 half, especially if we break 266. That's going to give me a lot more confidence here for this to make that push towards 271 half, which we basically ended up starting a nice strong rally dating back towards August 2019, right off of retesting that 271 half mark. So that's one that's going to be rather high on my radar. Otherwise, support you're watching here is going to be roughly right around 251. Below 251, that's when I think we're going to start to get aggressive. And then you can start to target the support level that you have off of this pattern, which would then push you down towards 237 half, which in all estimation, I don't expect it to give you that push to the downside so aggressively until after the CPI data. All right. So that's what I would look for off of this morning. If you can get the break over 262 here this morning, I think it's pretty much plausible to maybe take that trade up towards 266 being the first price target. Look to lock in your profits at 266 and leave a runner. That way you feel a lot more comfortable holding it for a much longer time given time. And then you see over that 266 off of the first PT, if you get that continuation up towards 271 half, which I'm targeting here. All right. So that's what I do like about this one. I'm really interested to see if this actually picks up momentum. Kind of similar to how we saw Microsoft and Meta do that kind of scenario yesterday with other names taking the downfall, leading the downfall. I want to see if Netflix actually picks up momentum here today, and that'll be high on the watch list. All right. Switching over to another name, I think another name that everyone has their eyes on as well. This is a name that particularly has not set a new 52-week low as of yet amongst a lot of names that have already done it in rotation. I'm going to be looking for Apple to give us that downfall. It's just going to be a matter of whether we get it before CPI or if it comes after the fact. That's pretty much the more sketchy part of trying to time the entry. All right. But what I'm going to look for with Apple here, particularly for today, watch to see if we get a break over 141.64. If we get the break over 161.64, then we could particularly see a gap fill that's going to take place. And that would put me into my second PT of 145 half, basically, is where I'm going to be looking at. And particularly that 145 half is actually a key marquee level. That dates back to your resistance from the beginning of the year from January 25th. And then it actually teetered support to resistance between that was July of last year to October of last year before you had a nice strong move to the upside. All right. So 145 half is relatively the level that I'm particularly watching. I want to retest that high from January of 2021 and see if that ends up being our overall resistance more so. And that's going to be our potential rejection. So just to drop it down off the daily, just to give you an illustration, that would potentially be just a tad bit over that gap fill that we have dating back towards November 3rd. All right. So that is something that, again, I'll keep an eye on that one, similar to how I say Netflix. If that picks up momentum, I'm going to look to see if Apple picks up momentum as well, with Tesla more so being the known factor of our relative weakness right now. All right. Let me just catch up on what you guys mentioned. I have been missing your awesome TA post, Veer. I appreciate it. Ed, AMD earning. Let me actually take are their earnings actually? Let me actually take a peep at that real quick. Let me see. I know that Nvidia has their earnings coming up. Okay, so they already reported actually. Take that back, it looks like. Yeah, I mean, I actually was liking the video here this morning, relatively to the fact that they actually had news this morning. That was something that actually caught my attention as I pretty much put up the chart here for you guys. But resistance that I was looking at before we had this gnarly pump to the upside, I had resistance 144.84. We gapped above that resistance. The next level of resistance I'm watching is 152 and a quarter, basically, is where I have my next level of resistance. So roughly about another $4 push here would actually not would be pretty reasonable. And that 152 spot actually is where we had relative resistance dating back towards May of 2021 before we had that monster rally that took us over $300 that was. Yeah, well over $300. But we started that rally right around that 152 spot. So if you notice, we are actually plausible to retest a lot of these breakout spots that we had over the past 2 years. We're going to be retesting those breakout spots as a potential resistance, is what I'm aiming for, right? Because we see a lot of these names just getting dragged up and dragged up, despite the fact that, of course, futures look like a bearish setup right now, a bearish rising wedge. A lot of these names are getting the rotation, they're getting their push into those prior breakout levels that took place a year or two ago. And so 152 is going to be my upside target here. Watch for continuation above 147 here. As long as it holds the 147 rather, then you should see that continuation up towards 152 on Nvidia. All right. Looking at AMD, I haven't looked at AMD. This is actually one that I haven't not actually got too much attention looking at it. But let me actually take a peep. Let's see what's going on with AMD. You do have a little bit of a bear flag scenario type of setting up here, I will say. But the marquee level that actually catches my attention is 67 here. That is basically a retest off of your breakout that you had dating back towards July 2020. That's going to be that 67 mark. And then 67 mark is also where we got continuation of a breakdown, a nice retest action. So 67 is going to be your overhead resistance. If we do see Nvidia continuing to rally, like I mentioned, towards that 152 level, then I would anticipate that AMD is going to get that sympathy. It's going to get continuation right behind rallying behind Nvidia, and we should see this make a push up towards 67, and that should be a viable trade here this morning. As long as support holds 62 half, then you should get that continuation back to the upside. Even if you get a little bit of a morning push back to the downside, as long as it holds 62 half, you should get continuation up towards 67. All right. Let's see what else there is that's kind of just circling around. Let me actually see if there's any headlines, anything that we need to be aware of for the day. I did mention that Take Two Interactive had earnings. They're actually down double digits. I wonder if actually Activision had any kind of actual sympathy to that. Okay, so Activision had no sympathy to that. I just wanted to see within that sector if we had any sympathy to that. Looks like headline right now, just giving you pretty much headline that's smacking the table right now is just about consumer confidence being near its lowest in a decade, being a problem. That's pretty much one of the headlines going around right now. Some of the tickers that are actually trending as of right now. Let's see what's trending at the moment. Let's take a look. Let's see. So tickers trending, of course, Apple is trending. Lyft also had earnings. That was something that was actually relatively bad as well. I saw that sinky yesterday afternoon, so that's rather disgusting. I believe this is also a new 52-week low that it just set off of that as well. It's pressing into that low rather. So it's gonna likely end up taking out that low dating back towards October 10th, and that'll be below 1083. We'll likely see if that sets a new 52-week low at that given point. So that's another name that's pretty much trending at the moment. Take two mention Apple, of course, I mentioned that. Well, what is actually Apple? Is Apple in the headlines for something that is trending? Or is it just structure? Let's see if there's anything. All right, so there's actually an upgrade here this morning. Okay, so that's why it's trending. We actually have Apple. Actually, there is an upgrade. Rises even as Morgan Stanley UBS tweak estimate on China-related phone issues. Okay, so no, there's not an upgrade, more so. Despite all of that, it's just showing relative strength, despite all the headlines. And that's actually something I've seen in the past. I think we've seen relatively that we've had bad news on Apple, And despite any kind of bad news, Apple's just been a name that it ends up continuing to push back to the upside. It pretty much ignores all the bad news. And then at a later given point in time, when the market pretty much tries to force that downside action and they end up having to sell, that's when you're going to get caught off guard and Apple's going to end up breaking down. And to be honest with you, I'm likely expecting by the end of next week, between now and the end of next week, we should end up seeing Apple hit a new 52-week low, as we see Tesla doing it, as we've already seen in the past here. Netflix has done it, Meta has done it pretty much endlessly times. I expect Apple to be that one. Pretty much, it's likely the last one that actually particularly needs to hit a 52-week low at whatever given point in time that it happens between now and next week. That's going to be the tricky part of knowing at what point in time you need to enter and how long you actually should enter and hold for that, right? But that's just my pretty much my echo my sentiment to that. Take that with a grain of salt. But that's what I'm just anticipating. We saw Tesla doing it now. We see it being that relative weakness. At some given point, once Tesla starts to get to the end stage of its downfall, then that may end up being the trigger for where Apple is going to be our biggest downfall here and should set that 52-week low. All right. So that's something I just wanted to pretty much express. Just kind of seeing what else is around the headlines here. There does look to be like this ticker is actually trending here right now. Norwegian. See if there's any headlines circulating right now. Not much of a headline here. It looks to pretty much be the fact of their earnings as being a spotlight here. If I bring this out to the daily here, yeah, it looks like their earnings were their spotlight. Not much of a reaction off of their earnings though. It looks like they're pretty much just holding steady right now. Resistance that I will be watching here on Norwegian though would be at this 19 and a quarter, 19.23 to be exact, is the resistance I'm watching here on Norwegian. So I would look to see if this actually does have a nice little trend day. We start to see some momentum building on this. I would roughly like to see this push towards that 1923. That may actually be a viable trade to take. If we do see this start to push, I would watch for the break here. If we get the breakout above $18, I think you could take that dollar and a quarter trade to the upside here. And that may end up being a nice one, relatively probably low volatility wise, that you can end up taking and you should be able to make some decent bank off of a day trade for that. All right. But 1923 will be my upside target on that. So that's another name that you could potentially keep on the watches here today. Just looking around, let's see what else there is. All right, so nothing else is particularly trending. Nothing else that pretty much catches the spotlight. But other than that, again, midterm elections are going to be the spotlight today. Let's see exactly if there's any headlines that come out in terms of favoring the results to one direction of a Democratic or Republican Party. That's going to be something that you're definitely going to want to keep an eye on and see how that ends up maybe kind of just drifting the market direction or causing any kind of market volatility, which I wouldn't necessarily anticipate. But other than that, there's nothing else that's on the economic calendar today that I see that stands out for us. So it should be rather clear skies. We should have a nice little trend day, particularly. I would hope it's not necessarily a range bound day because then, of course, that ends up just killing premiums, particularly, right? So especially those of us that are pretty much holding weeklies, that's not going to be very good, especially for out of the money, if we end up having just a range bound day. All right. But that is something to also be mindful of, especially given the fact I mentioned it yesterday. When the market is relatively waiting on data, and as we get closer to this economic data for CPI, we may end up being trading in a tighter range until we get that data and we get a, a convincing directional move in one way or the other. All right. But other than that, not much else that to say on my end. Not much else that stands out. I could pretty much highlight some other names that kind of just catch my attention in terms of levels. Watching Boeing here, this has been one that's been relatively strong, and this is where the one of those times where I actually do kind of kick myself because Boeing's one of those names, and I'm sure we can all relate to that. Is that Boeing acts like a dog because usually it's like endless bleeding. It usually goes the opposite direction where you whenever you least expect it. But then it's actually been such a monster the past what few weeks here. Ever since dating back towards their earnings, dating back towards the end of October here. That stock was just under $140. It's now over 100, pushing 166. So this is definitely one that it feels like I always miss the train on it, just because of how sporadic and how vertical this actually goes when it actually decides to move. And then, of course, I'm not a trader to necessarily chase the stock, but this has just been going up nonstop the past what 4 days here already, just vertical price action that we're seeing. But relative resistance I'm watching is right up towards that 172 mark is where I have overhead resistance. So roughly about another $6 move potentially that's on the books here. Pushing at 166 up towards 172, you're looking at about another $6 move here. If this continues to give us at least one more day of a strong rally here, 172 would particularly be that overhead resistance that you want to keep an eye on, and that also dates back. Probably pushed out to the weekly here, but if I zoom in, you basically see that's actually where the stock gapped up and made a strong bull rally dating back towards November 2020, and that was right at that 172 spot as well. And so that was also relatively where we made a nice little U-turn back to the downside, dating back towards August of this year as well. So 150, 172 should be that relative resistance on this. We'll see if it blows past it or not. But I would indicate that as long as this particularly holds 164, we should see continuation. And Boeing should be one of those names that continue to show relative strength in holding up the broader market as we see other names particularly take the downfall, aka Tesla. All right. But that's pretty much the gist of me. I think we're about to have the opening bell here within less than about 20 seconds. So other than that, I will leave the stream up for the next roughly 15 minutes or so. So you guys can actually see my futures chart. Let's see how this rising wedge actually plays out in real time here this morning upon the opening bell. We did get some regression off of that little morning pump. That was actually a good sign. We rejected my resistance just below that 38.37 mark. Let's see if we get regression. Let's see if we get down towards this 38.16 mark. If we hold or if we break below, changing this overall little pump that we've had the past 2 days here for the broader market. All right. So 38.16 is the level to the downside. 38.37 is what I'm looking at for the breakout to the upside to invalidate the bearish rising wedge. All right. But other than that, trade safe, trade light, and anything, just drop me a question in the comments here for the next 15 minutes, and I will be glad to answer for you guys. All right. But other than that, later, guys.